Let me ask you something. You ever finish an LSAT reading comp passage, get to the first question, and it's suddenly like your brain just hit a wall? You read every word, maybe you even underlined a few things, but now you're staring at that question like, what did I just read? Yeah, that's not just you. And it's not because you're bad at reading. Here's the thing that nobody tells you. LSAT reading comp is not about comprehension. It's about structure, purpose, intent. And once you see that, everything changes. Most people think the reason they struggle with reading comp is because they're bad at reading. But that's not it at all. You can read fine. You've read novels, academic articles, you've probably crushed essays with dense arguments and unfamiliar vocabulary. Reading itself isn't the problem. The real problem is that the LSAT asks you to read in a way that nobody ever taught you. Not in college, not in school, not even in most LSAT prep courses. Reading comp is not about memorizing facts. It's not about names, dates, or definitions. And it's definitely not about absorbing everything. What the LSAT is actually testing is your ability to zoom out and see the big picture, to ID the structure of the argument, and to understand why the author is writing what they're writing, and to track how ideas develop from paragraph to paragraph. It's basically a test of how well you can follow a line of reasoning in real time without getting distracted by irrelevant details. Let me give you an example. Imagine that you're watching a movie trailer. You're not trying to memorize the dialogue word for word. You're trying to figure out what's the plot, who's the main character, what's the conflict, and what's the overall vibe of the movie. And that is exactly how you should approach reading comp. The problem is, most students read the passage like it's a textbook. They're underlining every single detail, trying to hold everything in their head, and they're getting emotionally invested in the content, especially if the topic is interesting or, on the flip side, super boring. But the LSAT doesn't care about how many facts you can remember. What it does care about is whether you can tell what role those facts play in the larger argument. Are they supporting evidence? Are they examples? Are they background context? Are they objections from someone else who the author disagrees with? That is what the LSAT is secretly testing. And if you don't train yourself to recognize those roles, you'll feel like every question is a trap. Because here's what happens. You get to the question, you see two choices that both sound kind of right, you pick one, but it's the wrong one. Why? Because you were reading for content, not structure. Now here's where it gets even trickier. A lot of students might think they're reading analytically, but they're still falling into the same trap. They'll say, oh, I remember that line, or I know where that quote is, or this answer uses the same language as the passage. But the LSAT knows you'll think that way. That's why they design trap answers using recycled phrases from the passage. They want you to latch on to something familiar, even if it totally misses the author's point. If your strategy is based on remembering wording or scanning for keywords, you're walking right into their trap. The smarter approach is to shift your focus from what did the passage say to what was the author doing in each paragraph and why. Because when you train yourself to see the structure, to track arguments, transitions, and purpose, you stop falling for the shiny distractions. Bottom line, the biggest mistake students make on reading comp is thinking it's a memory test when in reality, it's a strategy test. And the sooner you make that shift, the faster your score is going to go up. Now let's talk about how LSAT passages are actually built. Because the secret most students never learn is that there are only a handful of passage structures the LSAT uses. They don't reinvent the wheel on every single test. They just remix the same few blueprints over and over again. And once you learn to spot them early, you can start predicting what's coming next before you even finish the first paragraph. That's the goal here, to get so familiar with these common structures that your brain goes, oh, I've seen this before. I know where this is going. So let's walk through the major ones. The first big one is the author versus someone else structure. This one shows up a lot in science, legal theory, and philosophy passages. It usually starts with a description of someone else's viewpoint, maybe a theory, a policy, a common belief, or a standard explanation. Then, at some point, often right around the middle of the first paragraph, the author steps in and says, "Not so fast." How do you know it's happening? You'll see contrast words like however, but, yet, and nonetheless. When you see that shift, perk up. That's the moment the real argument begins, because now we're hearing the author's take, and this is critical. When you get to the questions, they're going to ask you things like, what's the author's main point? Which idea do they support? And what is the purpose of the first paragraph? If you didn't catch that pivot moment, you're going to answer based on the wrong perspective. So always ask, who is speaking right now? Is this the author, or are they describing someone else's idea just to knock it down? The second big structure is the old idea versus new idea structure. This one is a classic, especially in natural science passages. It starts off by describing an older way of thinking, a long-held belief, a traditional explanation, maybe a historical trend. Then something changes. New evidence, new data, new technology, new perspective. You'll see phrases like, until recently, or it was long assumed that, or historically, scholars believed, and then bam, there's a shift. The author then introduces the newer idea, often in response to a limitation or a flaw in the old one. And that shift is where the LSAT's going to place 80% of the important ideas. So, what should you do? Instead of trying to absorb everything, focus on 3 key questions. What's the old viewpoint? What changed? And what's the author's opinion about the change? You can ignore most of the scientific jargon and still get the questions right if you track that arc. Now, the third big passage structure is the problem and possible solutions structure. This one's really common in law and public policy passages. It usually starts off with a problem. Maybe it's a legal loophole, a contradiction in the law, or a social issue that needs a fix. Then they introduce a few proposed solutions, some from other scholars or lawmakers, some from the author themselves. Your job is to pay attention to which solution the author prefers, and, just as importantly, how strong that preference is. Sometimes the author will flat out say, this is the best approach. But other times, they're going to be more subtle about it. They might say, this solution seems promising, or this approach may address some, but not all of the issues. That tone matters. Why? Because the LSAT loves asking questions like, which solution does the author most likely support? Which one do they criticize? And what's the author's overall attitude toward the debate? So if you're skimming and you miss the author's tone, you'll pick an answer that's technically true, but not aligned with the author's actual stance. The fourth passage structure here is the two sides with no clear winner structure. This one is all about debate. You'll see it in philosophy, science, and sometimes art or ethics. The passage lays out two perspectives, side A and side B. They each have their pros and cons, and the author often stays neutral, at least on the surface. But here's where students mess up. They so desperately want the author to pick a side, so they start reading between the lines, trying to find some hidden preference. But in these passages, that preference often doesn't exist, or if it does, it's very soft. So, what do? First, ID what each side says clearly. Then ask yourself, does the author support one of these sides? Do they offer a third perspective? Or do they just describe the debate and leave it unresolved? That alone will save you from falling for trap answers that assume bias where there isn't actually any. The fifth big structure here is the weird question that we want to figure out. This one is built around a mystery. The passage starts off with something odd, maybe a surprising discovery, a contradiction, or a result that doesn't make sense. Then it walks through different explanations. Think of it like a detective story. Here's the weird thing that happened, here are three possible reasons why, and here's the one the author thinks makes the most sense. If you can follow that trail, you're going to crush questions like, what's the author's hypothesis? Which explanation do they prefer? And what's the function of paragraph number 3? You don't need to memorize every explanation. You just need to track the flow of the argument and especially the author's judgment around each one. Now, the sixth big structure here is the big idea and associated case study structure. That is broad to specific, common in humanities and the arts. The author will open up with a general theory or claim. Then they give a bunch of examples to flesh it out. Each paragraph might explore a different case. Maybe it's different artists, different time periods, different regions. But here's the trap. Students focus too much on the examples that they miss the general point. So your job is to keep asking, what is the point of this example? How does it support the bigger argument? And what's the pattern the author is building? If you can answer those questions, you're going to nail main point, inference, and primary purpose questions, even if you don't remember all the details. So remember that every reading comp passage on the LSAT follows a predictable pattern. They're not random, and they're not designed to confuse you just for fun. They're structured, deliberate, and totally learnable. And when you train yourself to spot these setups early, whether it's a debate, a shift, a problem, or a puzzle, you move from being reactive to proactive. You stop just reading the passage and you start navigating it. And that's when your accuracy jumps. Now that you know the common passage structures, let's talk about how to actually read one the right way. Because here's what I see all the time. Smart students, highly motivated, great work ethic, still struggling with reading comp. Why? Because no one ever taught them how to read for the LSAT. They're either doing one of two things. They're reading too slowly, trying to memorize every single word, or they're skimming too fast, hoping something sticks. Neither of those strategies work. The sweet spot is strategic reading, and it comes down to 3 core steps, each one designed to help you stop getting lost in the passage and start actually controlling it. The first step is locking in the central topic. When you read the first sentence, you don't want to just coast through it. The first line is often the best clue to what the passage is really about. Think of it as the title the author didn't get to choose. It sets the direction, the field, and usually the core topic. But you've got to look beneath the surface. The key is to focus on nouns. What is the subject of the sentence? What is being discussed? Look for repeated terms. If the author says genetic drift in the first line, and then again 2 lines later, that is a clear signal. They're showing you, this is what we're going to be talking about, so keep your eyes on this. This one move, spotting the repeated nouns, is like putting a pin in the map before you start the journey. Without it, you're just wandering. The second step is to figure out the structure. Because now that you know what the topic is, the next question is, what kind of structure am I dealing with? This is where the passage types I just mentioned earlier come into play. But you don't need to explicitly label them. Just ask yourself, is the author introducing a problem? Are they explaining a shift in thinking? Are they building up someone else's contribution? Are they showing you 2 different perspectives? Or are they leading you toward a surprising conclusion? You're reading here to spot intention, not facts, not trivia. You're asking, what is the author trying to do in this paragraph? This helps you read with purpose, because now you're not just absorbing words, you are anticipating moves. You'll notice, oh, here's a pivot word. However, the author is stepping in. Or, oh, they just gave an example. That means the general point came right before this. You start reading like you're watching a chess match, not trying to memorize each piece, but tracking why each move is happening. Then the third step, and that's where most students mess up, is to fill in the framework as you go. Most students treat the passage like it's a long list of stuff they might be tested on. So they either highlight everything or they panic because they can't remember anything. But the key is, don't read for the facts, read for the structure. Every single passage has some kind of structure, and every individual paragraph plays a role. Here's what you want to extract as you read. What is being said? Why is it being said here? And how does it relate to the big idea? These three questions, what, why, and how, are your internal GPS. They help you figure out where you are and what matters. So, for example, if you see the author describing an experiment, ask yourself, is this supporting a theory, challenging it, showing a flaw? And if you see two historical figures being compared, ask, are they showing evolution over time, or are they contrasting two opposing viewpoints? This is the kind of thinking that the LSAT rewards, not recall, not memorization, but connection making. In terms of mindset, you've got to remember that most people read LSAT passages like they're studying for a pop quiz, but top scorers read like they're editing the passage itself. They're not trying to remember every single word. They're trying to understand how the passage works. They're thinking, this paragraph over here is laying out the problem. This example is just illustrating that earlier claim. And that last line, that is the author's conclusion. That's the level that you need to reach. And you don't need to be a fast reader, you need to be a purposeful reader. Let me give you a quick analogy on this. Think of the passage as a house that you're touring. Bad readers try to memorize where the couch and the coffee table are. Good readers are sketching out the floor plan. They know where the kitchen is, they know which room connects to which other one, and they understand the layout. Because if the test is asking you, where was the bathroom? You don't need to remember the tile color. You just need to know it was the second door on the left past the kitchen. So let's say you've just read the passage. You followed the structure, you tracked the author's purpose, and you understand the big idea. Now comes the part where most students crash and burn, the answer choices. Because here is the cruel trick of the LSAT. You can understand the passage perfectly, but still pick the wrong answer. Why? Because the LSAT is built to fool people who understand the content, but don't know how to evaluate the choices the way the LSAT wants you to. So today, I'm going to show you exactly what right answers look like, how to reverse engineer them, and what red flags scream out wrong, even if they might sound tempting. Now let's start with what right answers have in common. They usually follow a few predictable patterns. They're not flashy, they're not extreme, and they almost never use emotional language. Instead, they tend to be moderate, precise, and carefully worded. Here are some qualities you're going to see over and over. First, you're going to see a lot of synonyms and paraphrases rather than direct quotes. The LSAT hates to make it easy, so they're almost never going to copy and paste the right line directly from the passage. Instead, they'll rephrase it using different language. For example, the passage might say, researchers remain cautiously optimistic. Then the right answer will say, some scientists believe the outcome may be promising. Same meaning, different words. And if you're only scanning for exact matches, you're going to miss it. So train yourself to look for equivalent ideas, not identical phrasing. The second big thing to look for is moderate hedge language. The right answers tend to use cautious language. Words like some, may, can, often, sometimes, possibly, or not all. This kind of language is less extreme, which means it's safer and more defensible. If a choice says something always happens or never happens, it had better be explicitly stated in the passage. Otherwise, it's too strong. And the LSAT knows this. They want you to get baited by extreme language because it feels decisive. But correct answers play it cool. They'll say, here's what's likely, or this could happen under certain conditions. And that nuance is what the test rewards. The third big thing to look for is causal clarity without overstating it. And this one's a bit more subtle. Sometimes the passage will say that X leads to Y, and the right answer flips it and says, without X, Y would be less likely to occur. It's the same core relationship, but phrased differently. And the trap answers are going to take it too far. They're going to turn correlation into causation, or they'll make it sound like X is the only factor that matters. So your job is to match the level of certainty that the author is using. If they hedge, you hedge. Now, let's look at the wrong answers. They could be surprisingly convincing, and that is the point. They're designed to sound almost right, but they all fail in specific, predictable ways. Let's break down the 4 biggest red flags to look for. The first is extreme language. This is probably the most common wrong answer type. If the answer uses words like always, never, only, or must, you should immediately be skeptical, because almost no LSAT passage deals in absolutes. The test loves to trick you with this. You read something moderate, and the choice takes it to the extreme. It sounds bold, it sounds confident, and it's dead wrong. Correct answers live in the gray area, but wrong answers see everything in black and white. The second big pattern in wrong answers is out-of-scope add-ons. Now here's how this trap works. The first part of the answer sounds perfect and is spot on, and then bam, they sneak in a little twist. One extra claim that was not in the passage. If even one part of the answer is unsupported, the whole thing is wrong. Your job is not to say, well, it almost matches. Your job is to say instead, can I prove every single part of this answer from the passage? If you can't, cross it out. The third big type of wrong answer is the wrong emphasis or misleading focus. Because sometimes an answer is technically true, but it's missing the point of the passage and not answering the question that was being asked. So for example, let's say the author talks about several theories, but they clearly favor one specific theory. A trap answer might summarize one of the rejected theories. It's accurate, it's factually true, but it is irrelevant. Another version of this is giving equal weight to something the author clearly downplayed. You've got to be crystal clear on the author's intent. Not just what they said, but why they said it. And if an answer points to a side note instead of the main idea, it's out. Now, the fourth big red flag to look for is copy-paste traps with a twist. And this is maybe the dirtiest trick of all the test makers play. They will lift a phrase directly from the passage, something that might sound familiar, but then they slightly shift the meaning. It's like giving you counterfeit money. Same color, same size, same texture, but if you hold it up to the light, there's no watermark, there's no signature, it is a fake. And these choices are dangerous because they prey on people who are only doing a surface level reading. They know that you're going to see the words and feel comforted by them, but what you've got to ask is, does this actually reflect what the author meant? Not just, did I see these words somewhere? Because familiar doesn't mean correct. And on the LSAT, familiar is the bait. So you want to think of LSAT reading comp answers like legal contracts. The test writers are sneaky lawyers. They write 5 versions of the same clause. 4 are traps, 1 and only 1 is airtight. The wrong ones are hiding loopholes, stretching the truth, and sneaking in bold claims that were not ever approved. The right one is clean, careful, it uses hedge language, and is provable based upon the text. You're not just reading for what sounds good, you're reading like you are signing your name to a contract. And if you can't justify every single word, you walk away. Now let's get into the part of reading comp that most people dread, the questions. You finish the passage, you think you understand it, then you hit the questions and suddenly, every answer feels like it could be right. And this is where the LSAT is really flexing, because the trap answers are designed to sound good. They're subtle, they're slick, and they're full of familiar language. And if you don't have a game plan for each question type, you're going to get pulled in 5 different directions. So now I'm going to walk you through the 7 most common LSAT reading comp question types and show you exactly what the test wants, how to think about them, and how to avoid the traps. The first big question type is main point questions. This is asking you what is the author's core message. Not a summary, not a collection of details. The right answer is the author's overall conclusion. The payoff idea They're building toward the entire time. So here's how to break it down. The subject is the main topic, and the predicate is the author's take on that topic. So, if the passage is about urban farming, the main point isn't that urban farming exists, that's just a fact. The main point might be urban farming can address food insecurity better than traditional models. And wrong answers here are usually going to be too narrow. They focus on one example or one paragraph instead of the entire thing. If it sounds like something you'd write halfway through the passage, it's probably not the final message or the main point. The second big question type is primary purpose questions, and these are related to main point, but they're slightly different. Instead of asking what the author concluded, they're asking, why did the author bother to write this at all? What is the function of the passage? Are they challenging a theory? Are they highlighting an unappreciated contribution? Are they exploring a problem and suggesting a solution? The shortcut for these is to look at the first paragraph and the last paragraph. The beginning usually sets up a problem or the context. The ending often reveals why it matters. The right answer matches the overall purpose, not just a side point. And for these, you want to watch out for trap answers that accurately describe what the author discussed, but miss why they discussed it. Now, the third big question type to look for is paragraph function or role questions. These are zooming in to a specific paragraph and maybe even a single sentence and asking you, what role does this play in the overall structure of the passage? And this is where all that structural reading pays off big time. You want to know, is the paragraph providing background? Are they presenting a counter argument? Are they giving an example to support the main claim? Or are they introducing a contrast? What you want to do here is look for transition words at the beginning of the paragraph. However, usually signals contrast. For example, means support, and in conclusion means summary. If you read with structure in mind, these questions become almost automatic. The fourth big type to look for is meaning in context questions. These take a word or phrase from the passage, usually something subtle like this approach or significant, and they ask, what does this mean in this specific context? The big mistakes that students make here is going with the dictionary definition. The LSAT doesn't care what the dictionary says. They care about what the author meant right there. So you're going to want to go back to the passage, reread a couple sentences above, a couple sentences below, and figure out what the phrase is referring to and how the author is using it. The most tempting wrong answers here will often use a definition that is technically correct, but totally out of context. Now, the fifth big question type in LSAT Reading Comp is inference questions, and these are especially sneaky. They're going to ask you, what can we reasonably conclude based on the passage? They're not asking you, what's a cool interpretation or what do you personally believe? Instead, they're asking you, what is strongly supported by what the passage actually says? The right answer is not going to require you to make any leaps at all. They're just looking for the next logical step from what the author already gave you. And you're going to want to watch out for trap answers that go too far. They'll say something like, therefore, X must always lead to Y, when the passage only said X can lead to Y in some cases. That's where your red flag for extreme language should be on high alert. The sixth question type to cover here is the author's attitude and tone questions, because the LSAT loves subtle tone shifts. They'll ask you how the author feels about a theory, a method, a person, or an outcome. And your job is to spot tiny cues in the wording that signal tone. Words like unfortunately, surprisingly, remarkably, merely, significant, or controversial. Now here's the twist. The author almost never expresses strong emotion. They're not angry, they're not ecstatic. The correct answer will usually say something like qualified approval, or mild skepticism, or tentative support. If it sounds like a Yelp review, too emotional, too personal, it's wrong. Now, the seventh and final big question I want to cover today is analogy and application questions. These are definitely on the harder side. They're rare and they're tough. They're going to give you a scenario outside the topic of the passage and they'll ask you which idea from the passage is most similar to this new situation. And most students hate these, understandably so. They're like parallel questions in logical reasoning. But they're beatable if you stop thinking about the content and focus on the relationship. You want to ask yourself, what is the underlying pattern here? For example, if a passage describes a scientist modifying a theory based on new evidence, and then the question talks about a chef adjusting a recipe based on taste tests, that could be a match. The surface details don't matter. It's the function that counts. And the wrong answers will often match the topic, not the logic. So the best way to approach these is to paraphrase the core idea from the passage first, then match it to the example. Now remember that each LSAT reading comp question type is testing something specific. Not how much you remember, not how well you skimmed, but how well you can think in structure, purpose, and precision. If you approach each one with a clear lens, asking yourself, what does this question really want? And you pair it with the right mental model, you'll stop second guessing. And instead of choosing between 5 kind of okay answers, you'll spot the one that actually works. Because here's the truth. The right answer is always in the passage. It's always supported by the text. You've just got to know what the question is really asking. So now that you know what each question type is asking, the next level is knowing how to attack them. Because here's the truth. Even if you understand the passage, even if you understand the question, you still need a clear game plan for how to get the right answer fast, without reading everything 5 times and melting your brain in the process. This is where top scorers separate themselves. They don't treat every question the same. They adapt. They use different strategies depending on what the question gives them. And there are really just 3 strategies you need to master. The first is to research first. This should be your go-to method when the question gives you a specific reference, like, according to line 23, or the author mentions the study by Dr. Y in order to, or what role does the 3rd paragraph play in the argument? In other words, they're telling you exactly where to look. So you're going to want to go back to the passage text, start reading a few lines above and a few lines after the reference. Then find the actual wording in full context. And finally, then and only then, go to the answer choices and match the one that reflects that exact role, idea, or function. This is the safest and most straightforward strategy because it's text-based. You are anchoring your answer in something that you can literally point to on the page. But here's the mistake students make. They jump straight to the answers first, without refreshing themselves on what the passage actually said. And that's why they fall for traps. So if the question is telling you where to look, go there first. Don't guess, don't skim, just read the lines, lock in the logic, and pick the match. The second big strategy is to predict first. This is what you use for big picture questions like main point, primary purpose, tone, passage structure, and author's opinion. For these, the question stem isn't giving you a specific line reference because the answer depends on your overall understanding of the passage. That's why the worst thing you can do here is to go straight to the answer choices. Because once you do that, your brain starts trying to justify each option, even the bad ones. Instead, before looking at the choices, pause. Then, in your own words, ask, what was the passage mainly saying? What was the author trying to do? And what's their take on the issue? Then, go to the choices and find the one that best matches your prediction. This protects you from getting baited or tempted by a familiar phrase that is totally off base. You're not reacting, you are verifying. This is a huge mindset shift because now, instead of asking, could this be right? You're asking, does this match my understanding of the passage? And that one shift can save you from so many traps. The third big strategy is to go to the answers first. This is your best bet when the question is vague, confusing, or abstract. For example, if they're asking you which one of the following best illustrates the principle described in the passage. In those kinds of questions, you're not going to know where in the passage to go, and trying to reread the entire thing is not efficient. So for these specific questions, you are going to want to skim the choices first. You're going to want to look for keywords or ideas that jump out, ones that sound like something you saw in the passage. Then use those clues to reverse engineer your way back to the relevant part of the text. This is a search and match strategy. You're not predicting here, you are investigating. Once you've found the match, you then apply your usual filters. You're asking yourself, does it reflect the author's intent? Is it too extreme? Is it supported by the text, or did it add something? Again, no leaps, no assumptions, just pattern matching based on the evidence. Now, no matter which strategy you're using, there is one principle you have to follow. Define your support window. This means asking, what is the specific portion of the passage I'm allowed to use to justify my answer? If a question's about paragraph 1 and you're making an argument based on paragraph 3, you are outside the support window. If the author's opinion was clear in the last paragraph, but you're basing your answer on a side comment from the intro paragraph, you are outside the support window. The LSAT rewards precision. So, once you've ID'd the relevant part of the text, don't wander off, stay in your lane. You want to read deeply, but only where it matters. By now, you've got the tools to tackle reading comp effectively. But things could still fall apart if you get tripped up by the classic traps, the one the LSAT sets up on purpose. These mistakes are predictable, and they show up in every reading comp section. And once you know how to spot them, you can avoid them and jump ahead of the curve. Let's go through the 5 biggest pitfalls that derail LSAT reading comp scores. The first is getting seduced by strong language. This is the biggest mistake by far. You read a passage that says, some scholars believe X may lead to Y. And then you get to the question, and an answer says X always causes Y. Feels familiar, right? Looks tempting. But guess what? That's not what the author said. The passage said may. The answer said always. That is a massive difference. Strong language requires a high burden of proof. If the answer says never, only, must, always, or entirely, you'd better have a specific line in the passage that says the exact same thing. If not, it's a trap. Top scorers assume strong means wrong unless proven otherwise. If it sounds like it belongs in a ranty YouTube comment, it's not the right answer. The second big trap is assuming causation where there's only correlation. This one is especially dangerous in science and social science passages. You'll read that 2 things happened at the same time, or that one increased while the other decreased, and the answer choice will say, therefore, X caused Y. But the passage never said that. Just because 2 things are connected, it doesn't mean that one caused the other. This is a classic LSAT trick because causation sounds powerful. It sounds logical. But unless the passage explicitly says it, or gives you reasoning that strongly supports it, it's not safe. So anytime you see a cause and effect claim in an answer, you want to stop and think to yourself, did the author actually say that one thing caused another, or am I filling in the blanks? If you're filling them in, cross it out. The third big mistake is crediting the wrong point of view. This one burns people out all the time. The LSAT loves including multiple perspectives in a passage. Side A says this, side B says that, and maybe the author agrees with one of them, or maybe not. Here's the trap. The LSAT gives you an answer that reflects someone's opinion, just not the author's. And because it sounds familiar, because it's in the passage text, you think it's right. But remember, just because an idea appears in the passage doesn't mean it's the one the test wants. You always want to ask, whose voice is this? Is this the author's view, or is it a critic's, a historian's, a scientist's, a random example? If a question's asking about the author and the answer's quoting someone else, that's going to be a no. The fourth big one is falling for half right, half wrong answers, and this is the LSAT's favorite trap. They give you an answer that starts off great, First half sounds perfect, matches the text, feels rock solid. But then, in the second half, they sneak in something false. They're overreaching or it's totally unsupported. It's a classic bait and switch. They're counting on you to say, well, the beginning's right and the rest kinda fits, so I guess it's okay. But that's not how it works. Every part of the answer has to be defensible. Every single part. If even one piece is wrong or speculative, the whole thing is wrong. Don't grade these on a curve and don't fall in love with the first few words. Read the full answer like a lawyer reviewing a contract, because that's what this is. It's a contract with no room for close enough. The fifth big one is confusing relative versus absolute language. This one's a bit more subtle, but just as deadly. Let's say the passage says, Caesar was bolder than Pompey, and the answer choice says, Caesar was bold. Seems right, right? But that's not what the passage said. The passage made a relative claim, not an absolute one. The LSAT will absolutely test this. If the passage makes a comparison like stronger, better, earlier, more effective, and then the answer drops the comparison and turns it into a standalone claim, that is a distortion. It's a small shift, but on the LSAT, precision is everything. If the original point was about being more of something, and the answer drops the more and just says is, it's out. Now remember, the LSAT isn't trying to measure your reading ability. It's trying to measure your ability to spot BS under pressure. And these traps are engineered confusion. The best students don't just study the right answers, they also study the wrong ones. They're asking, what made this one sound tempting? Where did it go too far? And what was added or twisted? Because once you start seeing the patterns behind the tricks, you stop falling for them, and that's when your accuracy jumps fast. Let me tell you something that might surprise you. The biggest breakthroughs I've seen in LSAT reading comp don't come from more practice. They come from a mindset shift. They happen when students finally stop asking, what is this passage about? And start asking, why is the author telling me this right now? That shift alone can change your score. Because reading comp isn't a memory test. It's not about who can highlight the most. And it's not about who can remember which French philosopher appeared in paragraph 3. It's about structure, purpose, and intent. That is what elite scorers focus on. They're not thinking, this passage is about urban planning. They're thinking, the author is presenting a problem with current zoning laws, suggesting a solution, and backing it up with historical examples. And they're not reading passively. They are tracking the author's moves. They know when the tone shifts. They know when a new argument comes up. And they know when an example is just that, an example, not the main idea. That's why top scorers often finish the passage and can tell you the exact function of each paragraph without remembering every name, date, or term. Because they weren't reading like students. They were reading like strategists. Let me give you a quick metaphor here. Most students read the passage like they're tourists. They're looking at all the pretty buildings. They're trying to remember every street name. And if you ask them for directions later, they'd be totally lost. But top scorers, they're reading like city planners. They don't care about the statue in the square. They're building out the map as they go. They know where the main roads are. They know how everything connects. And when they get to a question, they could say, oh yeah, turn left at the second paragraph. It's right there. That's the level you want to reach. So here's your mindset going forward. Don't just do reading comp, diagnose it. What is the paragraph doing? How does it support the argument? And what is the author trying to show me, and why now? That's the question that unlocks everything. Why is the author telling me this right now? Once that question is in your head, every passage starts to make sense. The right answers start to feel obvious, and the traps start to lose their power. And that's how you stop feeling like you're guessing. And that's how you go from the 130s, 140s, and 150s up to the 160s and the 170s. That's how you unlock full ride scholarships. And that's how you stop surviving reading comp and start dominating it.